Welcome, folks. Thank you for being with us. Welcome to Democracy Nerd. I am Jeff Smith. Each time a policy is proposed, introduced, let's say Medicare for everybody, single payer, let's say an enormous investment, $2 trillion in infrastructure, the response from opposition is, how will it be paid for? It is sometimes heard when there's significant proposed investment or expenditure in the military. It is sometimes proposed when there is significant proposal for cutting taxes. It is always heard if there's a major investment proposal for something that might help poor people or might help do something about wealth disparities or impact the environment, etc. Recently, the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, announced $7 trillion in uncollected taxes over the past decade. $7 trillion is a lot of money. Might even be an answer to how are we going to pay for that? Easier said than done. There is a big ecosystem of tax lawyers, accountants, financial advisors. Our guest today refers to as the wealth defense industry. We'll get into that, to decide, leave that decision to you whether that's a fair descriptor, whose primary purpose is to shield major earners, significant wealth, from tax liability. If your job is to help your client pay less taxes, there are people who do that very well and make good money doing it. To talk about that, to talk about the collection and preservation of wealth and its impact on democracy is Chuck Collins, the director of the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute of Policy Studies, the author of the new book, The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Spend Millions to Hide Trillions. Welcome, Chuck, to Democracy Nerd.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Let's start out. First of all, how are you coping? We should at least be human beings for half a moment. Are you vaccinated? Are you an anti-vaxxer? Are you feeling good? What are your reflections coming out of the oddest 14 months in the last, I don't know, many decades?
Well, thanks for asking. I'm enjoying the coming of spring, the re-socializing with friends and neighbors. I did get vaccinated. I got the one jab Johnson & Johnson just before it came off the market for a little while, but
so you got the early one, one and done.
Yeah, one and done. And last weekend we probably had some of the first ordinary kind of like sitting with friends at dinner kind of. So that and just the coming.
So what was the energy
spring.
there? We just had our family over for the first time. What was the energy there?
Yeah.
The people gathered for the first time.
It's just a little bit of disbelief and also just wow, we haven't had that high touch connection in such a long time. So it's delightful. It's a joyful thing.
It was just my dad's birthday, and so we had the family over, and it felt both entirely familiar. Yeah, well, it was great. It felt both entirely familiar and oddly unfamiliar, and everybody was in a little better mood than normal, right? Like everybody was like, it was always would have been a festive thing, but it was an extra festive thing. So yeah, I suspect people are feeling those feelings. All right, let's get into it. Director of the program in Inequality, Institute of Policy Studies. What the heck is that? What do you do there?
Well, we're a research and advocacy group. We've been around since the early 60s, kind of a left progressive think tank and action tank. But the program on inequality, we specifically look at how this great concentration of wealth that's emerged over the last couple of decades, how that's affecting democracy and society and our health. And we co-edit a website called inequality.org, which is like a portal on data analysis and also campaigns and actions that people can do. So, and obviously this is a time coming out of this pandemic where people are mad and see how inequality made us more vulnerable during the last 14 months and cost some people their lives.
Say more about that. Give us the kind of story, the overlay between wealth inequality and you did say wealth inequality. A lot of people say income inequality. Do you have I have a preference. Do you have a preference in phraseology? Hashtag watch your language.
Yeah, I like to talk about both income and wealth inequality. They're slightly different dynamics. And I would say that the extreme inequalities were kind of the pre-existing condition in our society as we came into the pandemic, meaning you got half the population has almost no financial reserves, just trying to, survive, underpaid, underprotected, if you will. And then you have this top 10%, top 1%, and even this top 1/10 of 1% who have reaped most of the income and wealth gains of the last couple decades. And it seems to me the pandemic almost sort of supercharged those trends, that the most vulnerable people in the society who became our essential frontline workers became more vulnerable.
You want to spell that out? You want to sort of tease that, the dynamics that led to that? Because we now sort of know, right? People have seen probably Twitter headlines come across the transom of their phone saying, billionaires increased wealth by blank percentage. That didn't happen for poor people. Want to help us just kind of spell out how that went down?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, who didn't have the opportunity to telecommute, who didn't have the opportunity to work or sequester at home, and the number of people who went to work every day without health care, without sort of paid sick leave, juxtaposed with the fact that the U.S. billionaire class, and this is our research that you've been seeing over the last 14 months, the 700 billionaires in the United States saw their wealth go up $1.6 trillion over 14 months. Since 1990, billionaires have obviously seen, U.S. billionaires have seen their wealth go up, but a third of their wealth gains happened during this pandemic. So
what happened to everybody else? So
and
I think in the parlance, right, we have the discussion, okay, well, rich people are getting richer. Well, if the stock market's getting better, if the economy's getting better, those are different things. Then is that bad? Is it just being grumpy or jealous to point that out? How's everybody else doing?
No, I mean, it's the juxtaposition. It's the fact that other people have lost savings, lost ground, whatever, if people had any financial reserves. And, we're on the verge of an eviction and foreclosure crisis now in many communities. So, almost 600,000 people lost their lives. Many people lost their livelihoods and savings and maybe their health permanently coming out of the pandemic. And the, people who reap the benefits of owning stock or in owning companies that actually profiteered at different points during the pandemic have done extremely well. And by the way, Jefferson, coming out of the economic meltdown of 2008, 2009, that's not what happened. The billionaires lost their wealth, didn't recover for 4 years, the levels they had in 2007. So this just shows that it's really it's a heads they win, tails we lose kind of economy.
So I want to quote Denzel Washington from the movie Philadelphia. Talk to me like I'm a 5-year-old. How come? Right. So I understand. And, we've talked to Andre Cherney, who wrote, I mean, if an op-ed can be seminal, to me, it's a seminal op-ed in how I sort of see the world and understand. We wrote it about Alice Americans, asset, limited incomes constrained, employed, essentially the second quintile of the American economy. His quick story being that for much of American history, most of the 20th century at least, the middle three quintiles, right? The upper middle class, the middle class, and lower middle class all sort of traveled together. Good times, everybody did better. Bad times, everybody did worse. What happened during the Great Recession was essentially a separation between the middle class, the upper middle class, and between the middle class and lower middle class, reducing what we would call middle class. The example he used was Disneyland. Used to be 4/5 of the American people could basically afford a day at Disneyland. Now it's hard for 3/5 of Americans, easier for 2/5 of Americans to take their family to Disneyland. So we've seen that sort of separation. What's happened now in this pivotal time of history? Why is it even been better for the biggest repositories of wealth and worse for the destitute or the people who have a hard time making it by?
Well, I mean, I think what I would say is that the rules of the economy have been tipped in favor of people who own a lot of assets at the expense of people who work for wages. And the rules being tax policy and trade policy and what government spending priorities are. And if you do that for 40 years, you pull apart, you see this fragmentation. And, as you point out, the bottom 60% of households now, the Brits have a cool word. They call it the precariat, the precarious class. The bottom 60% literally are living paycheck to paycheck, living in a much more precarious state. They're not going to Disneyland. They're not going in. They're not going anywhere. The precariat. It's like,
and these are the folks you're talking about. This is what we hear. If they have a health problem, if they lose their job, they don't have daddy they can call to get the dough, or they don't have sort of a bank account or rental income or stock dividends that will pay the float as they look for their next gig.
Exactly. And then at the very high end, you now have the economy is kind of wired to funnel wealth to the top. You have the classic concept of rent people who extract rents and extract value from the rest of the economy. It's like a parasitical relationship. And take an Amazon or take any of the larger global companies. They are nickel and diming us and squeezing consumers and workers at every step of the way and funneling wealth to the top.
I still want to push on you a little bit, right? And get a little more granular and attempt to live up to the name of the show. That you said 40 years. So what happened? So it's 40 years of tax policy, 40 years of trade policy, right? If I go back 40 years ago, that's about 1980. That's basically the election of Ronald Reagan. And challenge me if I've done my temporal arithmetic incorrectly. But you also said that that the Great Recession, let's call it 2008, it took 4 years for billionaires to recover their lost wealth. Why is it different this time? If it's 40 years, well, it was 30 years then. So was it because the particular difference that the stock market didn't go down, stocks stayed high? Was it pretty much that simple? Was it Bitcoin? Was it real estate values didn't decline, so the wealth the repositories remained? Is it, and I want to get into this because I'm trying to figure it out for myself, is it in part there is now so much collected wealth that it has to buy things, and so there's limited number of real stuff to own, so that's why like any asset maintains its value, because there's so much wealth in accounts somewhere. It'll still need to buy stuff. And meanwhile, the stuff that's cheaper, the stuff that isn't wealth, the stuff that we have to live on, right? That stuff becomes harder to come by. Help me explain again. If I'm the Denzel Washington's lawyer character in Philadelphia, explain it to like a 5-year-old, or explain it like we're trying to live up to the title of the show and get as nerdy as you want.
Well, I mean, another way to understand is we've had a lot of productivity gains over these last few decades, and people date it to the late 70s. Mm-hmm. But the rewards to capital, to owners of wealth and investment, have just gone up, and the returns to labor, to workers, have gone down. So that's one nerdy concept, which is
that's helpful.
The productivity gains have gone to capital, and
we work harder, we work smarter, there's more automation, there's more things happening. Communication technology has enabled things to move more quickly. But because we've been sort of in the current policy landscape of the last 40 years, that hasn't been divvied up the way it might have been during, let's say, the Eisenhower years.
Yeah, and actually the Rand company did a very fascinating analysis. I haven't really looked at the underlying, but they said over this 45, 50-year period, some estimated $50 trillion that should have been paid to kind of worker productivity gains. If workers had shared in productivity gains, their median wealth would be higher, their savings rates would be much higher. I mean, a huge, that's the shift right there. What I think the difference between, say, 10, 12 years ago, the economic meltdown, was a kind of systemic collapse. It did affect capital and investment markets. And the wealthy rebounded way faster than everybody else. Yeah. In fact, many households coming into the pandemic still, were still wobbly, still had not recovered in terms of savings and economic, wages since 2009, 2010. So, but there's something about the market. The stock market just took off after an initial caving. Yeah. I think partly because the market's all about betting on the future. And quickly the market pivoted to betting on certain companies that were going to do really well in the pandemic and in the post-pandemic economy. The online cloud-based research, telemedicine, big pharma, gaming, all the things that we've kind of, online retail, all the things that we've sort of used more of in the last 14 months. Wall Street was betting big wins because they're also going to consolidate those gains in the post-pandemic era.
No, this is helpful. I'm a verbal processor. This, one of the reasons we do the show is one of the reasons I so appreciate having a chance to do it is help me figure things out. Maybe it's sort of simple, not easy, but simple, which is the crisis in 2008 was an asset crisis, and the crisis in 2020 was a productivity crisis, was an activity crisis. And so one impacted wealth in a different way, and one impacted sort of working people in a different way, and working people got screwed both times. And anyway, that helps me understand the story. Let's get to the book. The book is The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Spend Millions to Hide Trillions. So a friend of mine just bought a Freeport, which is which is in some cities around the world. If anybody has watched the movie Tenet or has watched the TV show Billions, you will have seen a Freeport, right? Freeport is where you can house art. I don't know if any of them are quite as glamorous as the one in Tenet, but maybe they're not as pedestrian as the one in Billions. But it's a place where you can house art without paying tariffs for shipping that art, and so it's a way to sort of hold wealth. And maybe that's at least a mildly accessible pathway in. Your book is saying that this kind of thing is a big deal. This is now a major piece of service that is provided to the sort of largest, wealthiest organizations and families in the world.
Well, I think the context is, and you have to kind of get into your inner billionaire here, Jefferson.
All right, sure.
You have
it's not much. It's more honed, I will say, than my outer billionaire. But go ahead.
Yeah. You have so much wealth that you need to spread it around broadly.
Yeah.
And you want to have it you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket. So you want to have your wealth in lots of asset classes. That's how the rich think about it. So I've got my investments in new companies, emerging markets, and I've got my wealth over here in blue chip stocks and certain kinds of stable investments. But I still have so much wealth. I want to be in real estate and land, art, jewelry, crypto. I'm going to just spread it.
Ultimate
real
diversification.
Estate, ultimate diversification. I'm going to have some in Portland. I'm going to have some in San Francisco real estate. So art is just one category of where the super rich park their money. And the value of a Freeport is you can buy and sell art, and it never enters into a national jurisdiction. And I visited one of these in Harlem. The whole idea is you go to the Sotheby's auction. I buy your, Rembrandt from you, Jefferson, which is sitting in the art port.
Which one? Which one of my Rembrandts?
One of them. I don't know.
Sure,
whichever
sure.
one you're selling.
One of my lesser Rembrandts.
Or maybe one of your Monets in the blue period or whatever.
Yeah, all right.
And so I buy it from you at Sotheby's.
I like Klimt. I'm a big Klimt fan. So I don't know if I'll part with those, but yeah, you can have one of my lesser Monets or lesser Rembrandts.
Yeah.
All right.
Hold on to your Klimt. Your Klimt is going to be a stable investment for decades to come.
Yeah.
But so it's a way that you and I do a transaction, and I'm not going to pay any taxes because it's in a stateless ownership zone. It's in a free trade zone.
Yep.
And so I don't have to pay any taxes on that. And then I can sell it in 3 years to, some other billionaire, and it'll go up in value, or maybe at least it'll hold its value. So it's just a way to park money. It's like a wealth storage unit. Some people get one of those garage bays down at American Storage and put their extra stuff there. You and I keep our stuff in art Freeports.
So your title is The Wealth Hoarders. Why isn't just the wealth protectors? Why isn't just the people who are smart about not being wastrels, right? It's maybe in the Bible, right? Don't just waste your resources. Also, if we're talking about family money, they have a fealty to the family that includes much of the base of that wealth. Some of that's new money, right? New tech money. There's certainly a lot of that, but there's also generational wealth, and generational wealth is something that if you just spend it, you might feel like a jerk, right? Like you received something, and it could feel like your duty to pass it to the next generations and to try to grow it. In fact, you'll be evaluated by your friends and evaluated by your family in large degree in large measure by the degree to which you're able to do as good or even better a job as previous generations in helping build the family esteem, build the family wealth, and make things better for the future generations of the family. Well,
in the book, I'm really zeroing in on the 30 million and up group,
Yeah.
all the way up to the billionaires. And I'm focusing on them because at that point you sort of have enough wealth that all your needs and desires are taken care of. Your children are going to be fine. Your grandchildren and great unborn legacy. At that point, you do have to ask a reasonable question. Why so much wealth? How much is enough? And why are you continuing to accumulate? And I would use the word hoard. And some of that is dynastic succession. You're trying to have a legacy. You're trying to, pass on wealth to your kids, not just trying to help them out to avoid suffering, but so literally they don't have to work. But I would say at that point, you're accumulating power. And in a democratic, self-governing society, that accumulation of power becomes democracy distorting and undermines creating a good society for everybody else. And that's where you and I should step in and say, this hoarding behavior needs an intervention. It's destructive to families, actually. That's a whole other side, but it's really destructive to societies.
This is helpful. I think this is helpful to understand. So at some level, right, we can argue about what that level is. Money is no longer about survival, right? Survival is taken care of, and survival even in a comfort. At some level, after survival, at some level, sort of the hierarchy of needs might come in, but at some level, comfort is taken care of, right? At some level, also, it is taking care of the having things or enjoying things. You'll be able to have lots of stuff, multiple places to go without paying rent, right? Multiple places to own where you can just go and sleep there. That's really nice. You can have friends over and impress them. Multiple things to be able to travel around in without paying a fee to be in that vehicle because you own the vehicle. You're able to hire people to do things you don't want to do, right? To save your time because time is precious. At some point, above that, right? For you, it might be that $30 million level. Other people, it might be a different level. It is no longer just about having or enjoying things. It is about being able to make things happen. It is being able to impact the world because you can change the composition of companies, because you can change the composition of, heck, maybe a legislative body or a city council, or you can put on a ballot measure if you so choose. At some point, it is about impacting the world, not only being able to experience it or live within it. Is that a fair or helpful way to delineate?
I think it is. I think, we know that passing on too much inherited wealth to children at a certain point becomes counterproductive. We know that happiness, that there's sort of a plateau, above a certain level. More wealth doesn't make you more happy. It is at that point at which you've met your basic needs, you've met your desires, you have the luxuries you want, et cetera. And then I think backing up from a society point of view, that's where we should also say, when people are using that wealth to exercise power, when they're using it to hire this wealth defense industry, to rig the rules so they don't have to pay taxes, well, that's a problem. If they're using their wealth to buy media and legislators and warp the political system, that's a problem. And yeah, I would say that cutoff is at that 1/10%, where it's no longer
1/10 of 1%. Is that 30 million? Is that about $30 million in wealth?
Yep, it's about 4 or 5 million in income and 30 million and up in wealth.
And top 1%
planners call.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, people call it the ultra high net worth households.
Right. So top 1% in wealth, not income, is about $5-10 million?
Yeah, it's about closer to $5.
About $5 million. So essentially, which is a qualified. So to our to any viewer who's sort of a well-heeled sort of investor class person, that'd be sort of a qualified purchaser is $5 million and up, but accredited investor is $1 million and up. And what's that? Is that what, top 5% is $1 million in wealth, or is that like in top 8%?
Kind of in the top. No, you're really the top. Like the top 2.5%.
Really, $1 million in wealth, include. Well, I guess that doesn't include family home. Credit investor doesn't include family home, but that's helpful because that gives us a little bit of a sense of what we're talking about. And what's the wealth level? Now, just a reminder of what's the wealth level of the median American, and what's the wealth level? Maybe even give us a couple of quintiles, right? Bottom 20%, second 20%, middle 20%. To the extent, I mean, you are sort of the national expert on this stuff, so I don't feel bad asking you the question. I don't feel like I'm quizzing you unduly.
No, fair question. The median, and this is, not the average, but the median wealth is about $140,000. So that's the
$140,000, and that's
household
mostly
in the
their
middle,
house, mostly their home,
mostly in
home, and maybe an IRA
equity.
or something.
If you were to kind of look at it through a racial lens,
Yeah.
The median Black household income is closer to 8,000, Latino 6,000.
Income or wealth?
I'm sorry, at median wealth. Yeah, I think. And what's fascinating
so
is
you just said is median Black family, median Latino or Latinx family has wealth approaching zero. As wealth, $8,000, which doesn't feel zero if you have $8,000, but it's not. But if you add it all up, it's not moving a lot of financial units.
And again, that's in part because lack of home equity, lack of home ownership, lower retirement security, retirement funds. That tends to be wealth for people in the middle.
And a big piece of that, I appreciate you bringing it up, because we can't get as two white dudes, we can't get sort of any further in this conversation without putting, like, sort of seeing it through a racial lens, seeing it through an equity lens, seeing it through an oppression or an anti-oppression lens, and recognize that when you talk about home ownership, right, in my neighborhood, in fact, in the house in which I am sitting, right, a Black person wasn't eligible to get a loan to buy this house, and this house's value is extremely increased over the last 40 years, and they weren't eligible to do that. Like, I think when I was born, I think the redlining didn't stop until shortly before or right around when I was born.
You're absolutely right, and this is where there's a gap of even, we don't have to necessarily go back 400 years to look at the legacy of racism and slavery and white supremacy and wealth building. If we just go back to the 50s and 60s, where there was systemic mortgage discrimination. We had, coming out of World War II, the GI
some of that
Bill.
stuff didn't. Give me a timeline there. Forgive my interruption.
Yeah.
My understanding, because you'll know better than I, my understanding is a lot of the redlining practice didn't stop really until the 70s. Do I have my timeline wrong?
It hasn't. It actually hasn't stopped. I mean, if you look at the leading up to the economic meltdown, 2007, 2008, 2009, and the ways in which households, Black and Latinx households, are pushed into the predatory mortgage sector because they couldn't get access to conventional, traditional lending. But just an important piece of the history, coming out of World War II, 1945 to 1977, the U.S. government subsidized home ownership for white households. We put millions of white households on the express train to wealth ownership. So
my neighbor owns a fourplex. Okay, they live in the fourplex. They're retired now. That retirement was enabled because they got a GI Bill first to buy that fourplex, and then got another government subsidized loan. I think another GI Bill loan to get another house. Okay, and they're they would have been considered some of this classic middle class white family, right? Not a wealthy white family, middle class white family. Now that fourplex is worth a couple $1 million. Right? They've sold their other house, and now they have a comfortable retirement. And it wasn't merely, and they worked hard, and good people, and I'm not knocking them, but just the classic example of the older boomer experience, maybe a little north of there, that didn't, they worked hard, but that's not the whole story.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a longer discussion, really, of how do we have conversations with our neighbors about the fact that some of us as white people got huge public subsidies that put us on the multi-generational wealth building train. I have an uncle was able to buy his farm in 1958 outside Lima, Ohio, with a farmer's home, 1% fixed rate, 35-year loan.
Yeah,
I think he told me once his monthly payment was $90, and it was that was heavily government subsidized. And those programs were racially discriminatory. So Black and brown Latinx buyers didn't get on the wealth building train. So that's why the home ownership rate is 70% for whites and about 41% for Blacks in the United States, the percentage of households.
And I appreciate you bringing it up, because it is easy. As soon as one says billionaires, right, it's easy to sort of say there's a conversation about the other, right, and which can attempt to free us from our own either culpability or at least participation in the context in which we live. And if we are criticizing the context in which we live, even if we have only minimal agency, we have some, and we have some benefit. So recognizing our own, I mean, I guess what the kids say today now is privilege is maybe a useful exercise. But we're not just talking about the other, right? We're talking about us.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at how advantage works throughout the economy. How we can't really talk about the racial wealth divide without talking about multi-generational disadvantage and multi-generational advantage.
Yep.
And I like to think of we've had these 40 years of extreme economic inequality, income and wealth inequality is one strand of the story, but there's a much longer story of white supremacy and, economic inequality and these two strands sort of weave together, and you can't just sort of just focus on one. We have to sort of see how they interact. And, I think it is important to talk about the billionaires to the extent that they are a driving force in these economic policies that have worsened the racial wealth divide, have worsened the economic divide. But that doesn't mean that we have no agency.
Yeah, it doesn't absolve everybody, but it's still a worthwhile topic. And also because the title of this show is not Class War Now. The title of this show is Democracy Nerd, right? It's trying to understand how we're stronger together than we are apart, how we make decisions in community, how we figure out stuff to make democracy work, and if that experiment is worth doing. And I tend to think, I sure as heck hope so. And at some level, right? And billionaire is at least a handy shorthand. At some level, we aren't just talking about what you can have or what you can enjoy or even what you can impact, but the power that you might be able to wield. And we are talking about something a little more like a king, right? We're talking about something more like a duke, something more like somebody who has landed gentry, particularly if we're talking about something to be transferred over generations. And that's something different than democracy, can impact democracy. In a previous conversation, we talked to Robert Lieberman, who wrote the book Four Threats, The Recurring Crisis in American Democracy. He argues that income and wealth inequality is one of those four threats, one of the recurring crises that threatens democracy and has throughout American history. I want to tease that. I want to connect that out a little more, like why this conversation is so connected to democracy. One way to do that is just asking, in addition to tax policy and trade policy, which people can probably understand, right? That's limiting that's lowering taxes at the upper end, lowering capital gains taxes, making sure payroll taxes stay higher, taxes on the middle class stay moderate or high, or however one characterizes them now and how they have been. Trade policy, I think people might understand a little bit of that and how that impacts offshoring of jobs. What are either amplify those, or what are other key policy choices that you think have been made? This isn't just something that happened. It's something that got done. What are some of the other critical policy choices that anybody wanting to consider themselves a democracy nerd should be able to rattle off quickly?
One is to say, well, public investments in things that create social opportunity and mobility for everybody else. So whether it's having a higher minimum wage, having access to education, being able to go to college without going into debt for decades, access to universal health insurance. I kind of back up and say, why is it that other advanced capitalist countries have way less inequality and greater social mobility than the US? It's because they have a higher floor. They have a sort of safety net, or I call it a decency floor, through which people cannot fall.
Decency floor. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's a helpful.
You don't lose your
phrase.
Job and you have to live in a car.
Yeah.
You don't go become destitute.
Yeah. If you're lazy or unlucky, you can have a worse life, but it's not so bad that you have to turn to meth and crime.
That's right. So you have a floor, but you also then have public investments in things that make it possible for everybody to have a really good life, access to education, healthcare, and then you put a limit on how much wealth can be concentrated in a democracy distorting way. And this, if you live in the Nordic countries, these are capitalist societies, vibrant capitalist societies with private markets and vibrant main streets and the like. But there's a limit to how much income and wealth you're going to accumulate. And there's a limit on how you can use that wealth to warp the system.
Yeah.
And this is where, from a democracy point of view, the key question to me is, you know, what's the difference between wealth and an oligarch? An oligarchic society is where you have so much wealth that you can rig the rules of the economy. You can put your finger on the scale and tip things in your favor. And, the reason I wrote this book is because this wealth defense industry is helping the coddle dynastic oligarchs. It's helping the rich get richer at the expense of everyone else in the society, and build up democracy distorting piles of wealth. But that's where I think it's a democracy discussion. It's central to what you're focused on.
So let's get into that a little bit. You said the dividing line between wealth and oligarchy, and that's, I think, hugely useful, because the American dream is to get wealthy, right? Like that is, and one can question the parlance. One can say, well, that maybe we should slightly differently define the American dream, right? Like maybe the American dream is to be able to feed your family and have enough adventure and safety in your life to feel that it is a life well lived. So I don't merely mean to pile on to whatever tropes are currently dominating our conversation, but nonetheless, like one of the things that defines the nation is the idea is if I work hard, if I have a good idea, if I get lucky, then I can do way better than my parents. I can do better than my grandparents. I can be rich too, right? A little bit, Mark Twain. I don't want to be a member of a club that have me as a member, right? I want to be able to, I want to be able to be the president of something or other, right? I want to be a big deal, and my ambition is going to fuel some portion of my life. I'm not only sort of a socialist communist share, I'm also an acquirer of things, a doer of things, and I want reward for my action. And that's a big part of the story. And quelling that's a different thing than saying, okay, wait. A revolution was not fought to make the United States a country to stop wealth. In fact, a bunch of wealthy people were involved in it. They wanted to protect their own wealth. But a revolution was fought in this country so that we didn't have a system other than democracy. So we did not have an oligarchy or a plutocracy or a monarchy. We did fight a revolution on that. That is an idea we are supposed to share. We ought to be able to build, not a 90% consensus, but we ought to be able to build a 2/3 consensus in this country, 75% consensus in this country. We don't want an oligarchy or plutocracy. Do I have it about right? What would you change?
No, I think you said it right, which is, the whole idea of dynastic wealth. I mean, we fought a revolution to separate ourselves from hereditary monarchs. And unfortunately, if you sort of play out the inequalities we're living through now, if we stay on the same trajectory for the next 20 years, we're going to have a society that's dominated by this oligarchic class. They're going to control the economy, the democracy, the philanthropy. They're going to use their philanthropy as an extension of their wealth and power. They're going to control the media and the conversation. The sons and daughters of today's billionaires will be in our faces like Kardashians every day, dominating everything we care about.
But instead of getting
that's what's at stake.
But instead of getting there because of an OJ trial and a sex tape, they get there because their parents, either got their parents' money or because their parents made a bunch of money.
Yeah, they are hereditary aristocrats. They're hereditary dynasties. They won the lottery at birth. They're today's billionaires' children, throwing their weight around.
And we end up being Peru or Bolivia or one of the countries where there is some pastiche, there is some conversation about elections and making decisions together. But basically, all the big stuff is happening because a relatively small number of people are making those decisions based on what is best for them and maybe some mild beneficence for others. And that is what at stake. And that's why your argument is it's connected so deeply to democracy. How do you compare this era now, the year 2021, with, let's say, 1912? With pick your year in the prior to the Progressive Era, maybe 1899, right, or the Gilded Age, and you'd have a better year than I would.
This is very similar. I mean, I think that the concentration of wealth and power was a little bit greater in 1910, the 400 families that got gathered together in this one, dance hall, we don't know because we didn't have the way to measure wealth at the point. But the first Gilded Age, you know, the democratic system was completely captured.
Yeah.
You know, obviously senators were not elected directly at that point, and the oligarchs pretty much owned, you know, half the U.S. Senate. And that the way that that affected democracy is it meant that they could block a generation of transition of important legislation, whether it was child labor laws or tax policies or just things that made the quality of life better for everyone else. But we're definitely living in the second Gilded Age, and if we don't do anything to reverse these inequalities, we're heading right back into that. We're becoming a Brazil, you know, with this very concentrated wealth at the top, precarious shrinking middle class, and vast precarious. That 60% becomes 80% of desperate precarious households.
And I like the historical reference because then it also helps pull it away from, I don't know, Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, right? It helps pull it away from Fox News versus whatever the heck to say that it's that Teddy Roosevelt was, you know, the Republican president, did as much or more than any other American to try to disrupt the trajectory at the time, which was taking us away from having democracy. Say whatever you will about trying to have, you know, labor unions to protect the democracy, having an education, compulsory education system, a bunch of the things that happened during the Progressive era. But just in making sure that there was a Sherman Antitrust Act, that there was the kind of tax policy that would justify or make possible, I should say, a middle class, that was not the enterprise of a single political party. And that was something that did build sort of rough, if not consensus, at least supermajority support in the country.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to point out that those were, you know, there were social movements of rural people and urban reformers, TR progressives, and they won the 1916 the first income tax, and the first estate tax, and those existed for the last over 100 years, slowed the concentration of wealth and power, slowed dynastic wealth, and you didn't, you know, after the estate tax, which was very robust for several decades, it really broke up concentrations of wealth and power that were undermining democracy. It opened up that period after the Depression and World War II, where we did grow together, where there was, you know, with our caveat about the racial discrimination and house, you know, but the rising tide did lift all boats, even in terms of income. So that's the problem. And we're right back to this peril that the estate tax has become optional for the super rich. You even had Trump administration people saying only morons pay the estate tax.
Because they hide their money.
Because they're able to hide their money, because they're able to hire workers, their wealth defense industry workers, to create trusts and other systems to avoid taxes.
So we might even have to do a part two, because I know you've got a 2:00 hard stop. But let's get into what you call the wealth defense industry, the folks who say you're a moron if you pay an estate tax, because instead you ought to hire the firm of Dewey, Cheatham and Howe and make sure that you don't have to do that. What are the most notable or surprising exercises or practices within that wealth defense industry as you describe it?
Yeah. Well, the tools in the toolbox are offshore tax havens, dynasty trusts where people can park money outside the reach of taxation, the creation of family offices that are huge piles of unregulated private wealth, sort of bursting into the news recently with the collapse of this Archegos capital management, which was a family office, a privately controlled pile of wealth.
Explain that.
Rich people create these family offices. They're like private trust companies, but they've carved out and fended off any kind of oversight and regulation. But then they go out and get involved in investments in various things. And then when they go bad, you know, the rest of the economy is put at risk.
Yeah, but explain Archegos for people who don't know it.
This guy, Bill Hwan, who was a private equity hedge fund manager who, took other people's money and invested it in a certain way, fell out of grace. He had he had to pay all these fines and fees. He reformed his investment company as what's called a family office. He went out and, made fancy bets on, the tech stocks and media stocks during the pandemic, lost about $20 billion, lost about $6 billion of Credit Suisse's money by these highly leveraged, very reminiscent of the, 2008, 2009 meltdown. The key thing to realize here is family offices are like the last vestige of the shadow financial system that we heard so much about 15 years ago, 12 years ago, in the aftermath of the economic meltdown. All I'm saying is there's a large sector of people who just are now working for the super rich to help them mask, hide, sequester their wealth and avoid taxes, to the point where at the opening of the show, you talked about, how come the rich, or how come there's $7 trillion of tax revenue didn't get collected? Where's that $7 trillion? Well, I can help you find it.
I think people have a basic understanding that this kind of stuff exists, right? I don't think that's news to folks that, okay, well, if I get a smart tax law, in fact, it's one of the things that is then used to even argue against tax proposals, because folks will say, well, why would we raise taxes? My taxes will go down, but there's somebody out there who has a fancy lawyer who won't pay these taxes, so I don't want any of this stuff. Call me a libertarian or call me an anarchist. I don't want any of this stuff. What is something that people might not know? What are other mechanisms, and including as you said, sort of the, or as we brought up the movie Tenet, right? Are there any tools that anybody that are sort of newer, that are novel, that people should be aware of?
In a way, what's new is the pace of the activity has accelerated, even during the pandemic. I mentioned dynasty trusts, but what your listeners might not know is that, there are several states, including South Dakota and Wyoming, that have changed their rules at the state level to make it possible for people to anonymously have a trust that will exist for centuries. That wasn't possible 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. They may know that you can create
the rule against perpetuities. I remember from law school, right?
Oh my God, you've spoken the words. Yeah, if you really want to go nerd, deep nerd.
No, that's the good stuff, right? Let's not dodge that
absolutely.
Stuff. Right.
And actually, that was what, if you think of the rule against perpetuities, which is basically a way of saying you can't create a contract or a trust that exists forever, because it was really a response to monarchy in the UK. It was a way of it was sort of like the commoners saying, you can't tie up the wealth of the society forever. You can't rule from the grave.
Yeah.
And South Dakota suspended their rule against perpetuities to attract dynastic wealth.
I had no idea that they did that. I did not know
Yeah.
that South Dakota did. That's very interesting. I need to tell Frank Michelman at Harvard Law School that question, because that definitely didn't come up when we studied property. We did learn about the fertile octogenarian, right? The mythical case of how you might be able to preserve the fiction of multiple generations by the idea that an 80-year-old might have children. The 80-year-old of either or both sexes and genders might still be able to have children and grandchildren. But yeah, this is not some modern or some socialist crazy idea. The idea that things should spread out, that there should be real opportunity, that you shouldn't govern from the grave, rule from the grave. Hey, that's common law British stuff. That's the stuff the United States wanted to preserve in the revolution, or even amplify rather than do away with.
Amen. Yeah. I mean, that's if to sum it up, we're kind of refeudalizing, or we're bringing feudalism to America. We didn't have a feudal system. We fought feudal. We are creating sort of vestiges of feudalism in the United States by creating perpetual trusts where wealth dynasties will exist for centuries, and where the sons and daughters, the descendants of today's billionaires will have trillions in wealth and power sequestered from taxation and democratic oversight.
Does Bitcoin make it worse? Does cryptocurrency, untracked and unregulatable money, make secret money, money laundering, and wealth preservation make it worse, or is it, or do you not have that in your crosshairs because it's kind of new and sexy?
I think it does make it worse. I think blockchain as a technology has the possibility of fixing it by sourcing money in a way that we currently don't source money. So we have, all this, I would call it kleptocratic money laundering, money gushing into the United States now. If you had a blockchain system where you could essentially see the derivation of
you could track it on the ledger. Yeah,
right.
If
you could track it on a ledger.
Track it on the ledger.
Might be one of the ways we fix it.
What's a ghost town neighborhood?
Well, it's a neighborhood that where wealthy people have bought up the real estate and where they're not living there. They're just parking their money there, like we talked about with the art ports, the free ports. Vancouver experienced this. So much money was flowing in from out of the country, buying up luxury real estate, buying up any real estate in Vancouver, that whole neighborhoods lost their social fabric. They lost their, street life because no one was living in the housing. It was all vacant.
But they were still
retaining, see this in high rises.
Those assets were still retaining their value because the only transactions that would happen would still be at a high would still be at a high price. So the paper value of that property was still high, even though it was producing no income, or even though it was, producing no like day-to-day use value.
Yeah, it's essentially one of the ways wealthy people were getting their money out of their countries and just parking it places where it could hold its value, and we saw that all over Canada and in a lot of eastern coastal cities and western coastal cities. This is a phenomenon, this parking of wealth, parking of global capital.
You offer a range of policy solutions, and I'm going to tease the question. I'm going to go through them very quickly. I talk far too fast. I want to apologize to everybody for that, or you're welcome maybe. And the question I'm going to ask is, any of these, or is there a characterization of some or all of them that you might want to put on a bumper sticker, right? That might be the Chuck Collins New Deal, Great Society, call it what you might, but a range of policy solutions: transparency against money laundering, corporate taxation and governance, disclosure of real estate ownership, disclosure of beneficial ownership, getting the United States in order. I want to understand what that is. Closing the individual wealth hiding practices, the trust loopholes, et cetera, enforcing global standards. Any of those in our closing minutes here that either you want to go in on, or how would you put this in a bumper sticker? Because I think, of course, bumper stickers, driving around cars, that's going to be the most important way we deliver political messages. Probably not, but go ahead.
Well, it is important to distill things down. First, you should invite me back, because I do have to jump off and join this live program. I would love to kind of go into detail, but if I would come back to what we talked about at the beginning. Enforce existing tax rules, for starters. Shut down some of these warped trusts that are just for the purpose of avoiding taxes. Transparency, corporate transparency. Who owns the corporation? Who owns the neighborhood? Who owns that real estate in our neighborhood? People should have a right to know. The U.S. cleans up our own act, and then we rejoin the European Union and other countries that are further ahead of us right now in cleaning up their hidden wealth systems. And we create some global treaties, and we shut down this hidden wealth system. That's the way forward.
We've been talking to Chuck Collins, Director of the Program for Equality and Common Good at the Institute of Policy Studies. That is a mouthful. The author of the new book, The Wealth Hoarders: How Billionaires Spend Millions to Hide Trillions. Chuck, thanks for your work. Thanks for the talk today. Hope to do it again. And thanks for being a democracy nerd.
Thanks, Jeff, for having me. Best to you.
Cheers, everybody. We'll be back at you.